The honor was bestowed upon him, of course, for his groundbreaking reporting on Harvey Weinstein in The New Yorker. Farrow has always been an early bloomer. He went to college at age 11. He was accepted at Yale Law School at 16. He deferred to go work at the State Department under the legendary diplomat Richard Holbrooke. He's had jobs at state and the UN. Now Farrow has written a book about how the United States relates to the world. For it, he interviewed many of the top luminaries in American foreign policy, including every living Secretary of State. This is his first TV interview around the new book, War on Peace, The End of Diplomacy and the Decline of American Influence. Pleasure to have you on, Ronan.
Pleasure to be here, Fareed.
At a time when there are these sensitive negotiations going on over North Korea, at a time when the Iran deal seems in peril, I think I want to ask you, what is the big problem you see with this, this sort of short shrift being given to diplomacy, with the State Department budget being cut? There are a lot of people who say, well, that's fine. The Secretary of State can go negotiate. The President can go and meet Kim. What is being missed here?
America is undergoing a fundamental transformation in how it relates to the rest of the world. We have fewer and fewer negotiators and diplomats and subject matter experts on the kinds of complicated situations like Iran and North Korea that you just mentioned, and more soldiers and spies making policy. And in War on Peace, I talk about the ramifications in a very immediate sense in conflict after conflict around the world.
So I look at, you know, when I was reading it, what I was thinking of is, with the Korean negotiations, there is a very complicated set of background material you need to understand. Those are the kind of details that area experts understand, assistant secretaries, deputy assistant secretaries understand. Is it your worry that that's the kind of texture that we're losing?
Literally, you can see the loss of that texture when you look at the structure of the State Department. So there were two earlier diplomatic runs at a North Korea settlement under Clinton, where there actually were some concessions made on the North Korea side. Then they cheated and it fell through. And late in the game, under George W. Bush and Condoleezza Rice. And Condoleezza Rice is one of the many secretaries of state to talk about that in this book. We talk at length about Chris Hill, the lead negotiator on those six-party talks at that point. When he attempted that, we had an entire North Korea unit at the State Department, experts who were steeped in this. And it's an oversimplification to say that was a complete failure. While in the end, we didn't get what we wanted, there were huge inroads made. They shut down some of their plants for the very first time. And I think the disappointment of the experts, Fareed, is that each time we make those inroads, a new administration steps away. The Obama administration stepped away. And right now, we're at a point where we haven't leveraged any of those gains in the past, and indeed seem to be throwing out all the people who know how to leverage those gains.
In fact, you point out in the Trump administration, there really has been, it's not just that they've not filled positions, but they've actually, in many cases, swept out lots of area experts, lots of substance, you know, people who understand nuclear weapons and things like that.
The State Department is being decimated as we speak. And I tell the stories of a lot of the, frankly, brave diplomats. These are people serving their country being forced out. The top nuclear arms expert at the State Department was fired unceremoniously in the first days of the Trump administration. This is at a time when that's one of our greatest challenges in the world. You can see the lack of logic in that.
The interviews with the Secretaries of State are fascinating. You have Colin Powell, very bluntly, a fellow Republican, former Republican Secretary of State, saying that Trump is gutting the State Department. Perhaps the most interesting one was Rex Tillerson, who gives you the only interview I've seen where he, on the record, describes his frustrations and essentially why he was eventually fired. What do you think is the big story? What did you learn from what Rex Tillerson told you?
So I think in each of these conversations with all of the living secretaries of state, people will find something surprising, some moment of candor they didn't expect. You mentioned how searing Colin Powell was, saying we're mortgaging our future right now. This is a man who cared deeply about the workforce at the State Department. That was a common sentiment. You know, George P. Schultz saying you don't have to take a job when he surveys the way Rex Tillerson acted on these orders to gut the State Department. And as you say, Rex Tillerson himself, really surprisingly candid in his last days in the job.
For example, he says he did not want those State Department cuts. He privately argued against them, But he thought, I think this may be his corporate background, once the decision was made, he had to be a loyal soldier.
He did, although he also said, look, I may have just been too inexperienced. He said when he started defending those deep, deep cuts to the State Department on the Hill, he had only been in the job briefly, and he might not have known better. He said, I think with hindsight, that maybe he would have done things differently. That seemed to be the suggestion throughout our conversation.
He said something very peculiar, that he thought that Congress would increase the State Department's budget even though he was not requesting an increase.
Which every other living Secretary of State I spoke to found astonishing. That's not how budget advocacy works with the Hill when you are the head of a government agency. But he said he thought going in that you could just ask them for less money and they'd throw more at you, which actually, in a bizarre set of circumstances, Fareed, he spent a year with Congress trying to throw money at the State Department and fight this administration and these cuts.
What else did you think that, with Tillerson, people are trying to figure out, was he fundamentally a good guy, shafted by Trump? Was he the wrong man for the wrong job? What was your takeaway?
With those comments he made about the lack of experience, I do think he was somewhat out of his depth. Despite having this peerless track record as a private sector manager, he seemed unable or unwilling to invest in managing the State Department. He put a lot of blame on the White House. He said the White House was cumbersome and slow and fought him at every turn as he tried to fill all of these empty roles across the State Department. There was a fair amount of passing the buck, but ultimately he took on that job, and I think it will stand as one of the most devastating and brief tenures of a Secretary of State ever.
You clearly are in love with the process of diplomacy. You talk about following Richard Holbrooke around as he was negotiating with various warlords and the Pakistani government. And is it your sense that that kind of thing is just not valued anymore in America?
Well, I'd be careful to say, I don't think that this book is in love with diplomacy. I think it views some very real problems in diplomacy with clear eyes. No one is arguing that America's diplomatic and development apparatus is without need for reform. It is a stultifying bureaucracy. I saw it firsthand. It's broken in a lot of ways. But what we are doing is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They are eviscerating the State Department rather than fixing it.
On October 10th of last year, The New Yorker published a 7,000-word article written by my guest, Ronan Farrow. It was titled, "From Aggressive Overtures to Sexual Assault, Harvey Weinstein's Accusers Tell Their Stories." Many more pieces would follow. This week, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his work on Weinstein, alongside Megan Twohey and Jodi Kantor, who won theirs for their work in the New York Times on the same subject. In the ensuing 6 months, the Me Too movement has exploded in the United States and around the world. I wanted to explore some of that with Ronan. What did you discover when you were doing the reporting? What surprised you? What startled you?
It was always very clear to me, Fareed, that this was not a story about Harvey Weinstein or a story about Hollywood. This was a story about the abuse of power and the way survivors of sexual violence are silenced and intimidated in this culture. And, those awards you described were given for not just this one article about the revelations related to Harvey Weinstein, but for a series of articles by me and a group of other reporters who did incredible work exposing those systems, talking about how if you are that rich and that powerful, you can hire, combat-ready spies to follow people using false identities. You can intimidate and influence the judicial process and the legal process. These are systems that we continue to need to examine in industry after industry and in every walk of life.
Do you feel that, when you say it's about power, it seems to me, it's about power more than even about sex. In other words, it is the inequality of the power relation that seems to be at the heart of it, that Harvey Weinstein could have hired people to give him massages, people who do that. But he chose to really humiliate these actresses, partly because I think I'm speculating here, but he liked that power differential, if you will.
He was in an echelon of powerful American man that can command tremendous resources to silence people. And that extended to the reporters working on this story. Many of us were threatened and intimidated in various ways. And I think we've all worked very hard to not become the story. But it is important that people know that in this country, you still see a version of the truth filtered by the most powerful people in this country. And media companies aid and abet that. The law aids and abets that at time. Those are real problems.
Do you think that we are now in a different place with regard to women in the workplace and their ability to work without having to live under, some of the kind of things you describe, or even the kind of double standards that women have always dealt with in the workplace?
I sincerely hope so, Fareed. I think that we have a long way to go. A lot of this story was driven by women who were tremendously brave and put a lot on the line, but also had the benefit of some spotlight, some platform. And in industry after industry, these same stories are playing out without the benefit of that spotlight or those marquee names. And this is happening from the boardroom to the assembly line. And I hope that what people take away from this is how